wait, make sure it's working real quick.
I think we're live. Yep. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. So, me and Ian, we decided that we are going to do a podcast. For now, we're thinking of doing this as a weekly thing. And we're still in the brainstorming stage, but we decided to just jump right into it. And the topic for this one is
Bakhmut and Stalingrad. So, to explain a little bit more, we want to diversify and dive into other topics. We're both big fans of history. Alternate history seems like a really fun topic, as well as politics, geopolitics, that sort of thing. Trying to get away from talking about Ukraine war all the time. However, we do know that most of the audience is, here for that reason. So for this first episode, we thought it'd be an appropriate topic to discuss the comparisons and contrast between the battles of Bakhmut and Stalingrad. So, just a few quick housekeeping notes. We developed a terrible thumbnail and logo for this. So if anyone wants to help us out with that and has any ideas for that, let us know. We're also considering doing live Twitter polls just on various things we're talking about, like throughout the podcast. So without further ado, Mr. Weeb Union, what do you think about the situation in Bakhmut at the moment? I think that's a good place to start. We'll talk about, what's going on there and give you guys an update on that as quickly as we can.
All right, so I see we're jumping straight into the juicy stuff. So yeah, Bakhmut, it is a battle that has been fought since, essentially since the first week I started doing YouTube. The first video that I actually got a decent amount of views in is a video where I was reacting to history legends talking about Bakhmut. And so essentially my channel has been built around Bakhmut from the start to now.
Who is History Legends again? I'm not sure.
Is that one guy we talked to that one time? Anyways, okay. So it's a really close battle to my heart, this battle, because it is something that I've grown up with. It's like it's a part of my personality now, Bakhmut. But anyways, what is currently happening in Bakhmut? So the situation is essentially that the Ukrainians are or have started their withdrawal of the city. They have somewhat finished their withdrawal from the east of the Bakhmutovka River. I think I should get a map going so that the viewers can follow. Present share screen quickly.
Before the podcast, me and we were talking about how risky of a claim it is to say that a withdrawal is happening, because I mean it's like every other day someone claims that Ukraine is retreating or Ukraine is about to withdraw from Bakhmut, and here we are, March 4th, and it still actually hasn't happened yet. So, but we both this week have actually reported to various sources that we believe that a withdrawal is imminent. So.
So essentially, what does it mean that they are withdrawing? It's not just everyone get out of the city now, we are moving. It is a very long process, and that is because the Ukrainians want to avoid as many casualties as possible with this withdrawal. At the same time, they still want to buy some time. So essentially what they're doing is that they have this final road in and out of the city. It goes here to the south of Khomove, to Ivanivske, and then northwards towards Chesev Yar. And this road is very muddy.
On that?
What was it?
Because I think typically people are familiar with the highway that goes to Ivanivske and then the road that goes to Khomove. Yeah, but you're saying that there's a road in between them?
Yeah, okay, so the northern road, which goes through Khomove to Chesev Yar, is now unavailable. And that is because there is geolocated information that this bridge that goes across this small river here has been blown up. It is proven, and there's no debate on it. This road here is essentially non-existent. It's not one that can be used. So this road the bridge has been blown, so no one can pass through the northern part here. And for the southern part, the Russians are less than 200 meters from the road, and it has been determined to be unusable, not just by Russian sources, but also pro-Ukrainian sources. So the only road that is left is this one that goes from the south of Khomove, so it doesn't pass through the bridge. It goes down from here to Ivanivske, and then from here it goes northwards in this slope kind of way, and then it goes northwards from this direction by the forest line all the way, and then it goes to Jezhev Yar. So it's essentially a road like this.
Actually have, oh, I'm already sharing it. I'm sorry. This is actually pictures of that blown up bridge that he geolocated there, if anyone is curious. But this is in, is it Kromove? Is that how you
Yes.
pronounce it? Kromove?
I think
so,
in Ukrainian you skip the K.
okay. Kromove.
Yeah. So with this being the final road in and out of Bakhmut, the Ukrainians thought, okay, if we're going to retreat, it has to be now. And with an estimated force between 10 to 20,000 within the city, they need to withdraw because an encirclement that counts that many losses is irredeemable. I did a collaboration with History Legends where we were reacting to two Danish colonels who are lecturers at a military strategic studies program for the Danish military, and they said that a encirclement of Bakhmut would be so catastrophic for the Ukrainian army that that part of the front line will be in a critical situation. So they're not looking to lose all of their men here in Bakhmut. So they have started their withdrawal because they only have one exit left. However, just telling everyone, just leave the city, you have to go now, is not going to work because such a large concentration of forces will be easy targets for the Russian armed forces, air defense, or their planes, their air force, and their artillery. So they will essentially be destroyed if they go out in large numbers because they will be easily detected and they will be easy targets. So what we have seen is there's a lot of videos coming out where they're leaving in small squads of 10 to 50 people. In high numbers, 50 people, like 3 armored vehicles, low numbers as in 5 people just walking. So essentially they're going out in groups. So the Ukrainians are leaving slowly. And when it's 10,000 people that are leaving in groups of 5 to 50, then they'll have to go, at the very least, if everyone was leaving in groups of 50, there would be 200 exits. So it's going to take a long time for them to retreat out of the city. And at the same time, they have separate units in Ivanivske, as well as in Bohdanivka and Khomove, who are fighting against the Russian advance to prevent them from cutting off the final road. So they have their defenses in the flanks, and then an exit here. So that is the current situation in Bakhmut. The Russian forces are trying to advance within the south, east, and north, while the Ukrainians are trying to hold the final road open as they retreat out of the city, and it's a long process.
So going back to what you're saying about the number of personnel actually in Bakhmut, because I think there is some debate over that, and it's really tough to know for sure, because like with a lot of these things, and with most of our reporting, it's all open source intelligence, and there's just really no, we have to kind of trust the information we're being, that's being put in front of us, as well as, kind of making our own assessment of it. I've heard wildly different numbers on how many troops are in Bakhmut, and I'm not going to say one's true or one's not, but like I kind of want to get your opinion, like breaking down why you think one is accurate and one is not. So like 20,000 troops to me probably does seem like a pretty large number of personnel in such a small enclosure, as we see on your map there. I can actually share the deep state map here real quick, just so we can see it. This is a very small area for 20,000 soldiers to be in. Now, Bakhmut is, a town that before the war started had a pre-war population of 70,000 in the actual city itself, and for the general area, I guess you would say like the Bakhmut metropolitan area was probably well over 100,000 people.
Mhm.
So I mean, they definitely all fit in there, but do you actually need 20,000 troops in that small area? Is Ukraine keeping? Do they have brigades worth 20,000 troops fighting in the Battle of Bakhmut, but are they transferring reserves in and out and keeping those reserves in Chasiv Yar? That's one thing I've heard. So the competing claim that's being said is that there's between 2,500 and 5,000 troops actually in Bakhmut itself, which I
Mhm.
also am very skeptical of. Do you think that that's even enough troops to hold the front line in the city, based on like um, perhaps they need less troops because there's more cover? I don't know. What do you think about that?
Okay, so starting out, how many troops are there in Bakhmut? As you said, we can only rely on open source, open intelligence sources. And one of those sources that gives a good overview of how many soldiers there are based on visual confirmation of different units. And they have been doing this since 2014, since the Civil War started. And that is militaryland.net. Let me see if I can bring it up right here. So on this map, we can see that the Ukrainian forces have 4 brigades within the city, and then there's this border detachment and a regiment. So here we see that there's essentially 16, 17, 18,000 troops based on if they all were at 100% strength. That is why my estimate is between 10 to 20,000, because I assume if they are below 50% strength, they would be pulled out and rotated. And if they are around 50 to 70% strength, that is what I would estimate it to be. So somewhere around 10,000 troops. Now, why would you need so many troops within a city? Now, I will stay true to the title of this stream, Bakhmut to Stalingrad. In Stalingrad, it had a pre-war population of about 400,000 troops. How many soldiers were fighting within the city at the peak? Over a million on each side. So that's about 5 times more than the pre-war population. That is the same as if they had 500,000 in Bakhmut. That is like an insane number. Imagine the whole front line, all the soldiers on the whole front line. Everyone is just concentrated inside Bakhmut. That is like such an insane degree. So Bakhmut is nowhere near the intensity of Stalingrad, but compared to this war, it is a lot of soldiers for one single place. And
What
at the
about
same time,
considering? I'm sorry to cut you off, but what about considering from a firepower perspective? Because we talked in the last podcast that we don't see this many these large numbers of troops and formations, or large death counts in battles in this war, as we've seen like in World War II, like mainly because like if you want to put 10,000 rounds of like rifle ammo at a hilltop, you need multiples or way less troops to do that, to achieve that nowadays, than you would have in World War II. Like if you wanted to put that kind of firepower on a ridgeline or a hilltop, you had to have 5,000 guys with M1 Garants, 8 shots every couple seconds, and then you got to reload. Like it just takes a long time to put that kind of firepower on a hill. Whereas nowadays, you have more effective artillery. Auto cannons is like a huge thing like that. I mean, think about how many troops the firepower of a modern day autocannon on a BMP replaces. I mean, things like that. So, like, what do you think? In terms of firepower, could it be comparable to Stalingrad?
okay, when it comes to that, I can't say I am a specialist when it comes to the logistics of Stalingrad. I've taken some or read some information about the airdrops of the German army during the Stalingrad encirclement. But when it comes to how many rounds they were using, I'm not exactly sure. In perspective, we see today that the current equipment that the Russian army is using can generally, also the Ukrainians, they also have modern artillery that is on par with the Russian ones. They can fire about 10 shells a minute. And comparing that to World War II equipment, that would be a much lower rate, but in a much higher quantity. as I mentioned earlier, about 1 million compared to 10,000 here, so 100 times more. But essentially, we're seeing the Russians currently fire on the whole front line from Kherson to uh, the Kharkiv part of the front line, about 16,000 shells a day. And that is compared to the Ukrainians firing about 4,000 shells a day. And if you're wondering where I have these numbers from, it's not just out of my back pocket. The source for that is the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, who sent a letter to the European Union where he cited that they were shooting about 110,000 shells every month. And that was only 1/4 of what the Russians were firing. End quote. So
Actually, I have a picture of this for everyone, but,
yeah,
but keep going.
you can add on it. So essentially, 110,000 shells divided by 30, that's about 3,600. What I estimated it to be around 4,000. That is a number we've seen before. And then the Russians firing 4 times as much, that's 16,000. So 16,000 shells a day is an insane number. I'm not going to say wait, you know what? I'll let you put up the picture and then I'll take a second to remember exactly how many shells they were firing back then in World War II.
While you're doing that, I'll just read this off for everyone. It says that Reznikov, who is the Minister of Defense, who was actually wrapped up in a, I guess you would say, an embezzlement scandal, right, where the Ukrainian military was overpaying for food, and he was probably pocketing the cash. But I guess he's still in charge. But he writes that artillery plays a crucial role in eliminating the enemy's military power. On average, Ukraine was firing 110,000 155 millimeter caliber shells a month. He says a quarter of the amount used by Russia. If and this is direct quote, if we were not limited by the amount of available artillery shells, we could use the full ammunition set, which is 594,000 shells per month. He said, referring to the capacity of artillery systems available to Ukraine. According to our estimates for the successful execution of battlefield tasks, the minimum need is at least 60% of the full ammunition set, or 365,400 shells per month. So that's actually very interesting, because I think it's definitely surprising to hear that the full capacity, the full firing capacity of Ukraine's artillery systems is nearly 600,000 shells a month. Makes me wonder what the full capacity of Russia's systems are, which are certainly more numerous, right?
And also something very important to note is that we are currently seeing in this war, as I mentioned, they can shoot up to like 10 times a minute, the modern artillery systems. While the shelf life of these barrels that are used to actually launch the artillery is actually very low. They can usually muster up to a couple of hundred shots before they start becoming inaccurate. And after 1,000, they're essentially useless. So if they shoot 10 shots a minute, that's an hour and a half and they're completely useless. So the logistical situation with the repairs and maintenance of these artillery pieces is a nightmare for both sides, but especially the Ukrainians, because although they receive all of this equipment, they don't receive the mechanics, they don't receive the specialists who are able to repair these pieces of equipment. And at the same time, the Russians are constantly launching missile strikes on their factories, reducing their industrial capacity. So whenever they need to repair a lot of their equipment, they send it to Poland, they send it to Romania, to NATO countries, where they can be repaired there and then returned to the battlefield. That is for the Western equipment. For the Soviet-style equipment, they have received a lot of spare parts from former Soviet countries, Soviet bloc countries like Slovakia and Poland, and then they're using that wherever they can. For example, as I mentioned earlier, the Russians are launching a lot of artillery strikes and missile strikes on the factories. But in Kharkov, for example, they have a large underground factory that is essentially untouched since the start of the war. There, they are doing maintenance and building, producing new tanks, artillery systems, and all of that. So that is the main hub for maintenance and production of Soviet-style equipment for the Ukrainians. And if we look at my map, we can actually see that I have a part where I essentially show all of the supply lines in this war. Look here, supply lines. And we can see that there is a connection to Bakhmut straight from Kharkiv, where the Ukrainians just sent their equipments back and forth between these two locations, which is why it is very significant that the Russians managed to cut off this northern route as they have cut off this railway. Now they have to go around from Kharkiv down to the Sloviansk area, and then they had the highway, and then they cut off the Soledar area, and now they have to go to Kramatorsk, Slovensk, Konstantinivka, and then from the southern route, and
So
now
were you
they've cut
saying
that as well.
before? Sorry to interrupt you again, but were you
Yeah,
saying before that Solidar fell, that railroad was actually operational, or
that
to a
is
certain extent?
that is to an extent, yes, because although they couldn't transfer easily between Liman and Siversk directly, they have a lot of pontoon bridges across the river line.
Yeah,
It's
there's
not clear
no
exactly
rail
where.
bridge there anymore. It was destroyed
Yeah, yeah.
last summer, right?
But they can use the rail to Liman, after which they can use the roads down to Sloviansk and Siversk. But now both of these routes are off. So now they have to go down to Sloviansk, then to Konstantinivka, and then here through to Jezef Yar, and then to Bakhmut. So this has become much more complicated. So most likely, most of the heavy equipment and artillery is they're having a difficult time replacing it as they continue fighting in this area, as the supply situation has become very complicated. And I can't imagine the nightmare around Siversk.
It's fascinating what you said about the barrels, and I'm wondering, was that similar, like with the artillery barrels in World War II? Were guns back then, were those barrels even interchangeable, or were they just designed differently? Like, was that a big logistical challenge for the Soviets or for the Russians? Was like moving barrels back and forth?
I believe it wasn't as big as an issue back then compared to today. And the main reason being that I refreshed my memory with a quick Google search. And essentially, the World War II style artillery systems would launch a maximum of 4 shells a minute. So that is 2.5 times less than today. So the amount that goes through those barrels is way less. And at the same time, the size of the artillery shells were technically or generally around 55 to 65 millimeters, where today the main uses are 115, 120, 155 millimeters. So
So
much
they're
larger
much,
shells as well.
yeah.
So higher rate of fire and larger shells. And at the same time, with the higher rate of fire, takes more time for them to cool down the barrels, which makes it much easier to overheat. So in situations where they're doing a lot of rapid fire shooting, the barrels overheat much quicker. And if we look at a lot of the Western reactions early on in the war, specifically around the first summer of the war, the general conception of the Westerns or Western soldiers reacting to this war was that we didn't even know that our systems could fire at such a fast rate because the Ukrainians just kept firing all the time as much as they could because they had to match the Russian output. And the Russians were aware of this issue from very early on because they were launching at the very start of the war about 50,000 shells a day. So they ran into this issue very quickly. So they started massively mobilizing their industry to create a lot of motors as well as barrels for all of the artillery systems. And at the same time, if we look at the Second World War, a lot of the time the front line would move a lot. So specifically now the Battle of Stalingrad, they had a good supply route as the Volga River allowed them to transfer troops and equipment through the river. And that would be like a lot of heavy equipment because the ships can carry a lot more weight than trucks or any land-based transportation system. So they didn't really have that much of a difficult situation with their logistics. But the German logistics was horrible. It was so bad that they were essentially running on the initial supply that they had for a long time before the trucks eventually came. And the trucks were also in such a bad shape that essentially they had to use horse-drawn carriages to supply their soldiers 5,000 kilometers from the front line. So, so the supply situation for the Germans was terrible, while
Makes
for the
me it
Soviets it
makes me
was
think of that
amazing.
scene from Band of Brothers. Have you seen Band of Brothers where he's screaming
No,
from the back of the truck, "You have horses! What were you thinking?" But
well,
yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
essentially that.
I couldn't imagine like that's such a vast different distance,
Mhm.
right? Like from German industry all the way to Stalingrad and moving stuff, horse-drawn carriage, which I'm sure it was probably more rare cases that it went the whole way like that. Like it probably went most of the way on rail. But like one of the things people
Yeah,
don't understand about Russia or the Eurasian steppe is like if you zoom out and look at like a railroad map, it looks like there's railroads everywhere, right? But like in reality, like there's vast differences in between these like different railroad hubs. I mean, way bigger than the distances are in more concentrated populated areas like in Germany or like East Coast of the United States and stuff. So like losing access to a rail line is could be life or death for an army. Like whereas in Germany, like if that's like where the battleground is, there's a million different ways to reroute supplies. So
mhm.
yeah, it's very fascinating what you're saying.
Also,
Um,
something that people tend to underestimate is the rivers. The rivers is the key supply route for everything in our modern society, as well as 100 years ago. Generally, like ships can carry tons upon tons of equipment, like hundreds of tons, while a truck can maybe possibly carry up to 5 or 10 tons. So it's
the
much
price
more
difference
efficient.
is huge too
Yeah.
between it. Like people don't realize that, but like, and this is where
Mhm.
we're both like pretty educated on this because we've dove pretty deep into Zion's books and everything. But
Mhm.
the difference in I think per container mile is the way to measure this, right? Because like you take a shipping container, you can take it off a ship and you can put it on the back of a truck, or you can put it on a train car. So it's the
Mhm.
same unit of measurement. But for moving a container per mile on ship, it's 17 cents on average.
Mhm.
Probably that has doubled or tripled since all these supply chain issues in the last 2 years, but typically like 17 cents. For moving it on rail, it's like $2. And then for moving it on the back of the truck, it's like $5 or $6. Or I might
Mhm.
have that I'm just snowballing here, but like it's
Yeah.
vastly cheaper to move stuff on water than it is by land.
Mhm.
So, people don't really appreciate how
Yeah.
important it is for a country to
Mhm.
have like a network of internal waterways, because that lowers the cost of everything, and it means there's like more wealth to go around. Because like I mean,
Mhm.
if you think about it, not to go too deep on the tangent here, but if like let's say the grain, right? Like for a ton of grain is worth $1,000 on the international market. Like just
Mhm.
assume that, right? So if you're Russia, if you're Germany, if you're the U.S., if you're Brazil, it doesn't matter. Whoever you are, if you're trying to make money on your grain, you want you want people to buy your grain instead of other people, so you want to try to undercut that price by a couple dollars, right? Make yours
Mhm.
cheaper. But on top of that, you want your input costs to be as low as possible, so you're making a bigger profit. Well, most of these countries, like Russia and Ukraine especially, actually have very low profit levels that they make off of this grain because they have to move it either by truck or by rail. I mean, if you want to talk about like a nightmare in terms of transportation costs, like you should look at Brazil. Like it
Mhm.
costs so much money to move all the agriculture out of the middle of Brazil down off of the cliffs. There's virtually no rail lines, no rivers that they can move stuff on, and then to the ports. It's super expensive. They basically make no money by the time it hits the ocean.
Mhm.
But with America or with Germany, there's a vast internal network of waterways where you can float all this stuff down. So, like when a Russian farmer is spending, $300 for a tank of diesel to move a truckload of his stuff, halfway across the country to get to a port. An American farmer is basically paying nothing to dump all that grain onto a barge and kick it down river and float it to the ocean. So like that's one of the reasons why internal waterway networks are super
Yeah.
important, and a big disadvantage for Russia economically, because the only true internal waterway that it has is the Volga, and it dumps into the Caspian Sea, which is landlocked. So
Yeah.
very fascinating.
I think that is one of the benefits for Russia if they manage to occupy Ukraine, is that they will be able to have the Dnieper River, which would significantly improve the economical situation in that part of the country, as it connects to the Black Sea and all the way past Belarus and into Russia in the north. So generally, that's a huge advantage. But
Oh,
back to
absolutely. And if you think about it, before the Soviet Union fell, they not only had the Dnieper, but the Dniester is navigable
Mhm,
for 100 miles or so as well. So the area of Moldova, Transnistria,
mhm.
potential has a lot of wealth potential as well in terms of
Yeah.
commerce.
And back to the supply situation of the current war. Let me share my screen again. So essentially, the importance of Mariupol and why the Russians were so desperate to get it at the very start of the war. And if we look at the supply situation, so generally in a port, what you usually have is that the ships reach the coast, they dump their cargo, they then are transported from the dock to the supply station or the trail station, and then they are supplied away. However, the ports of Mariupol are essentially, if we look in and zoom in, they can essentially dump their cargo straight from the ships and onto the trains, like directly from ships to the trains. And that is such a significant advantage. Like you can see here, the cranes lift cargo from the ships. That's the cranes, that's the cargo on the ships. That they pick it up, put them over here. A secondary crane picks it up, loads it on a train, and then they just move. So this supply situation for the Russians is so much more efficient than any other port in the whole Black Sea. The only one comparable to it is Odessa. However, that is so far from the front line, so let's not talk about it. So essentially, the Russians having control over Mariupol allows them to significantly increase their supply situation in this area, as they send a lot of supply by rail down to Rostov. And then from Rostov, they transport both from the Azov Sea to Mariupol and also by rail to Donetsk. So a lot of supplies go down to Rostov, and then they go straight to rail and then by sea to Mariupol. So they have these two main supply routes to Donetsk, as well as the port of Bryansk, which is much smaller, and they don't have the benefit that Mariupol has. They have to do truck, then train for the Zaporizhia front, as well as Crimea for the Zaporizhia front. So the supply situation is very complicated, but essentially Mariupol increases the efficiency by heaps, as they don't have any complications when it comes to transporting from ships to ground to land.
Yeah, I agree with that. In some cases, I will say, um, and I had kind of like dabbled in these thoughts, like when we were talking about Kherson, where Russia was trying to supply Kherson across the river. In some cases, where the distance, like the shorter the distance is, I mean, you kind of have to like look at this in terms of cost, like, and if the cost with logistics, the main cost is time, right? Like how long does it take to get something somewhere? And especially in these instances, that's what's important. It's like how far back is our ammo? How far back is our fuel? Like how long do we have to wait for that sort of thing? Like when you're talking about like moving stuff directly across the river, rather than just driving straight across a bridge, like it take you 5 minutes to drive straight across a bridge, but how long does it take to load up all the stuff on a barge, get across and then unload it? I mean, way longer, right? So like in
Mhm.
those shorter distances, like the cost doesn't make sense. But when you're talking about even like the distance from Mariupol to Rostov, like when you're moving like a lot of like heavy equipment or a lot of ammunition or something like that, especially since there's actually no rail connection there at the moment. I don't know if you guys are aware, but the rail connections were actually, dismantled over the last 8 years or so, like in the Donbass war. But it is actually faster to move a lot of that stuff by water than it is driving it across land, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Now we have talked a lot about the differences between Bakhmut and
Well, I
Stalingrad.
actually do want to like give an argument in terms of a comparison between Bakhmut and Stalingrad. So, considering like Bakhmut almost as like a part of Stalingrad, like not all of Stalingrad, because if you look at like the entire population of the Donbass industrial zone, like now and back in the 1940s, it's about 6 times larger than Stalingrad overall. It's just more spread out, right? So like, I guess you can like my argument would be that they share a similarity in terms of PR. Obviously, both sides have pretty much put all their effort into this battle, claiming that this is the pivotal point in the war. Like whoever wins the Battle of Bakhmut is going to have a huge morale advantage over the other. So I do think there's a big comparison there, but I also think that there's probably a good case that you can compare the damage inflicted on both sides. Like if it turns out some of these stories are true and that the Ukrainian side, and this is like I hate the casualty discussion because like everyone gets so crazy about it, but like even if you were to consider that the Russians have taken more casualties trying to take Bakhmut than the Ukrainians have defending it. Let's say, just say that the Russians have taken double the casualties trying to capture it. Russia has 3 times the population of Ukraine. So like if Russia took 30,000 casualties trying to capture it and Ukraine took 15, it's not a favorable exchange for Ukraine. Now, I don't think that's the reality. I don't think that's what's happened here. I think that it's very possible that Ukraine has taken casualties to an extent that Germany took in Stalingrad, enough to where it might break the Ukrainian army. This is one thing in terms of history, like talking about Stalingrad. Up to that point in that battle, the Germans were absolutely kicking the Russians' ass, right? Like they had made it basically to the gates of Moscow and had dished out casualties like 10-1, 20-1. I think there was something like 3 or 400,000 German casualties to like close to like 2 or 3 million or something by the time they reached Moscow. I'm not exactly sure. You can probably figure that out in a quick Google. But it was completely lopsided. And the thing with the German army was it was very experienced. It was very disciplined, right? And it was also very committed on the Eastern Front. So when Stalingrad was lost, I believe the Germans lost like almost 1 million soldiers, like 1 million of their best troops in that fight. I think ultimately when it was encircled, there was like 300,000 that were encircled or something like that. But overall, it took the wind out of the Germans. And I think that might be what we're seeing now with this Battle of Bakhmut. It's like, it seems like it has that potential. So I do think there are some comparisons on the philosophical front, I guess you can say. But in terms of ammunition and people involved, probably not.
On the casualties debate, I would say I'm more leaning in the fact that the Ukrainians are taking more casualties than the Russians. And I base that off of the firepower difference. I think the number of troops on each side is approximately the same, while the Russians have, at the very least, like on the general front line, according to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, 4-1 advantage. So at 4-1 advantage, while having the same amount of troops, that's about what you need to attack a city. However, they're not attacking it straight ahead. They are enveloping around it. So they need the 3-1 advantage. So in that sense, they would have more than enough to fight the Ukrainians. So I believe that they are in a position where they are essentially able to inflict more casualties on the Ukrainians than the Ukrainians are able to inflict on the Russians. Not to get into any details on how many, because that's completely into speculation.
Mm-hmm.
However, something that I do believe is interesting is what you mentioned about how the Germans essentially had the advantage all the way to Stalingrad, and then Stalingrad was the turning point of the war. And as you mentioned, huge casualty advantages on all the way to that point. One important battle was the Battle of Kiev in 1941, where essentially the German army encircled 650,000 Soviet troops. That is the largest encirclement in history, and that is essentially all the Russian troops in this war. Imagine if they all were encircled in one
Yeah.
big pocket. Like
Yeah,
that
it
would
was
be a
that
complete
was a huge
collapse.
encirclement. It was a huge army, and practically none of them survived. Right, like it
Yeah,
was like
because they went
the ones that were
internment
captured
camps,
went
and
into the
yeah,
camps. I agree. I lean more the direction that Ukraine has probably taken more casualties. Of course, what you're saying is like we don't know, but like my main point is like I really don't think it matters because unless
Mhm.
Ukraine is dishing out, you know, 8-1 and 9-1 casualties against the Russians, like I really don't see um, them beating them in an attrition war. Like if that's the goal is to out attrit the Russians, those are the kind of numbers they need to achieve, and I'm just not seeing evidence of that.
Someone is asking, and Stalingrad wasn't the biggest encirclement in history. No, it was not. And
No,
Battle of Kiev was the biggest in history, as
there was
the
actually several
Germans.
others that were bigger than Stalingrad too.
Yeah, but specifically the Battle of Kiev was approximately, according to German sources, 665,000 Soviet troops.
Mhm.
Some varied up to 700,000, some decreased all the way to 600,000, but somewhere around that interval between 600 and 700,000. While the Battle of Stalingrad was about 300,000 to 400,000 German troops encircled, and that
I
is
think
because
there
it
was
was a
probably
single
other
army group.
encirclements that the
Mhm,
Soviets achieved against the Germans that were also bigger. Like a lot
mhm.
of the cities in Poland and in eastern modern day, I'm sorry, Western Ukraine, the Germans just kind of like held up in the cities, and the Soviets just went around them, to breach into Germany's. And on top of that, the entire German Northern Army was encircled in Courland, modern day Latvia, right? So like there was probably more than 350,000 German troops in that encirclement as well.
Mhm. So, a very interesting video that I like to show whenever I talk about World War II is this video where it shows the war every day with army sizes on each side of the front line.
Oh, I
So,
love
if we
this. Let's do
look
it.
at it here, right there. So, we see here the initial balance was that the Germans actually had an advantage with about 700,000 troops, and the Soviets had about 2.7 million. And then we have there 324,000 troops encircled. Like that's a huge pocket already at the first days of the war.
Now, hold on a second. That right there is just to like find that on the map. That encirclement, I believe, is modern day. Um,
I'm pretty sure it's in Belarus.
Bialystok, right?
I'm not sure. But it's in Belarus.
Okay.
Oh, it could be Vilnius. Is that what you were referring to?
No, I think
Like
uh,
Vilnius, the Lithuanian capital, I believe it is.
it might have been. It might have been. I'm not exactly
Yeah,
sure.
but essentially the first encirclement in Belarus, and then there was the encirclement of Minsk right after. Then we have 150,000 here in Lviv, 250,000 in Estonia, and then here comes the Battle of Kiev.
Or there
Well, at
was
the same time,
310.
310,000. So yeah, we see hundreds of thousands of soldiers being encircled multiple times in a month.
That looks like Smolensk, maybe.
100,000 there. This is around Kryvyi Rih area, maybe a bit further west. Multiple pockets
80,000,
of 80,000
80,000. Yeah,
around
people don't
Mykolaiv.
understand the scale of like. I don't think it said it there, but it was
There we go. 667,000.
667,000. Wow,
Like
that is
just
absolutely.
and at the same time, we see the numbers on each side. It's equal. It's about equal.
Mhm.
Despite we've just seen the Germans have encircled over 2 million soldiers in like 3 months, and they still managed to increase their total army size.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, don't think that the Russian military is going to collapse because they took 100,000 casualties or 200,000 casualties. They have less people than the Soviet Union had at this time. However, that is only about 30% less. The Soviets managed to, throughout World War II, I believe they mobilized over 30 million people. The
Would
Russian
you
Defense
say that
Ministry.
that Eurasian peoples culturally are casualty casualty insensitive?
Honestly, with the history of Europe and Asia, both of them, especially the Chinese history, I would say yes, because have you seen any of the Chinese civil wars? In any
Oh my
one of
gosh,
them,
the
you can
Taiping
Google,
Rebellion.
yeah,
Like case in point.
you can Google a random Chinese war with itself, like a civil war, and you will see casualties in the tens of millions.
Hmm.
It's insane. But yeah, essentially, the Soviets managed to mobilize about 30 million, 20 to 30 million people throughout World War II. And Shoigu, the defense minister of Russia today, has said that the total reserve force of Russia, like all the ones who've gone through their conscription, is 25 million. That's probably all the way to like 60 or 70 years old and down to 18. But that is still 25 million that he's essentially implying that they are willing to sacrifice if it becomes necessary. So I believe that thinking that Russia is going to lose just because they take a lot of casualties, that's like out of this world.
Well, it goes back. It goes back to the Afghanistan war, and this is like I think honestly, it's arrogance on behalf of like Western governments because Western governments have always said that it was our efforts in Afghanistan that caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. The casualties that Russia suffered at the hands of Stingers and whatever, and Russian mothers being upset about their sons dying in war was what caused the collapse, and is an utterly ridiculous statement. Like if you only knew like how many like bad things and destabilizing things that were happening inside of the Soviet Union at the time, there was such a long list. I mean, if you want just like general communist corruption was like one of them. Like after years and years of that, like the economy was like essentially at a standstill. And then you have Chernobyl, which is like a huge event. Like people don't even realize like the effects of Chernobyl. There's probably a pretty good argument, I'd say, looking at demographic maps of Europe, that Chernobyl has really like assisted in tanking the demography of most East European states. Like if you were to look, let me see if we can pull up a European demography map real quick. This is
While you're doing
kind of
that,
a tangent, but
while you're doing that, I want to mention about the thing you say about Chernobyl's significance. And I think you also mentioned this specifically before, but the fact that what was his name, Gorbachev, who did a lot of reforms to westernize and democratize the Soviet Union, decided, got the genius idea, let's make free press at the same time as Chernobyl. So Chernobyl happens, here you go, free press. You can criticize us as much as you want right after a nuclear disaster.
yeah.
Terrible timing for such
Yeah,
reforms. I think
very
generally
bad
the
timing.
Soviet Union would have been able to survive for much longer if they did not push that many reforms at such a fast pace, because the Soviets had been used to for generations at that point to the kind of rule that they were living through. There was a lot of corruption and a lot of issues with the Soviet Union, but it worked as the Soviet Union. Like it wasn't unstable. The country didn't want to separate. Actually, the biggest fighter for the separation of the Soviet Union was Russia. Russia was the country that wanted to separate from the Soviet Union the most, even
That's
more than the
actually
Baltic states.
interesting. To clarify my position, I was not saying that it's a mistake to have free press. I don't want anyone to
Me
think that.
neither.
I was not saying that at all. I was saying that in terms of like if you're a dictator or if you rule an
Mhm,
empire and you want to hold it together, that was a terrible time
mhm.
to decide to liberalize. I guess that was
Yeah.
kind of my point.
It's like
Um,
imagine China building a nuclear factory that's huge and then it just blows up and like creates a huge environmental disaster, and then the next day they're like, let's open China to the internet.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
of course that would be a good thing from our perspective, but from the Chinese perspective that's a huge disaster
It
politically.
would only amplify the collapse, which is
Exactly.
obvious. Honestly, probably what happened with well, perestroika, is that what they called it? The reform. This is the best I could do. There was a way more detailed map that was showing the population collapse in some of these Eastern European states. Actually, I bet you. Actually, no. I actually know where that map is. It came from this book.
Good old Peter Cyan. I remember before the war, I would keep watching his content, and then after the war began, I realized that he may be getting some orders from under the table as to what he's saying because he doesn't sound like himself.
Yeah, well, I think I've thought a lot about the way he portrays information now, and like, cause like actually listening to his stuff, his conclusions are the same, but I think he's like arguably kind of smart about the way he portrays information because he um, leans really hard on pro-Western information, but then comes
Hmm.
out with the same conclusion. Like even despite all of that, like it's not like he's the one that was saying that like even like he buys into the idea that Ukraine's only taken like 30,000 casualties and the Russians three times that. But from his own videos, he has said but that doesn't matter at all. The outcome is still probably going to be the same. And I think what that
Hmm.
does is like the masses of people that are willing to believe whatever they hear, like they end up, listening to what he has to say. Like if he was to say things that would like credit, how people are in our comments all the time, like we're pro-Russian or we're pro-Ukrainian or like
Hmm.
whatever. Like if you get into that camp, like people take you less seriously, unfortunately, which I think well, arguably, a certain number of people will take you less seriously either way. It's impossible to get away from it. But
Yeah. Well, yeah, I agree. I think generally Peter Cyan's biggest issue is that he essentially relies too much on Western news media and is not that critical of the sources that he uses for his information.
yeah,
And because of that, taking just one side of the story gives you a false image of what's actually happening. That's what differentiates us with other Ukraine war reporters, is that they just pick a side and then they're like, whatever the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense is saying is facts, and whatever the Russian Ministry of Defense is saying is cap, and we're not going to believe them. Or the opposite, whatever Donbass Devushka is saying is fact, and whatever the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense is saying is cap. They can't say the truth. And then
right.
we have, for example, my sources. I go with a lot of neutral sources actually, but I also go with the Deep State map. I go with the Rivers map, Wargun. So, uh, what else? The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Like I take a lot of sources into consideration when I make my mapping. And then we have someone like, not to mention any names, but the typical pro-Ukrainian YouTubers who are like, okay, so this is a live UA map or this is a deep state map, which are Ukrainian sources who are pro-Ukrainian and use Ukrainian sources as their main source, and then say this is exactly what's happening, and anything else is false.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It is super interesting. The way the information sphere has developed, and it's concerning as well. And it's like I mean, and one of the reasons why I take a neutral view. I was joking around. I said this on Twitter that I would tell everyone if I ever reached 100K followers on Twitter. But I'll go ahead and tell everyone now. But the main reason why I don't pick a side in this is like because I'm an American. Like I believe that in terms of like my position, my country should come first, and I really don't believe that we have any interest in Ukraine. Now, that does not mean that like I side with Russia on this. Like, war is a terrible, awful thing, and there's like a lot of innocent people that are dying right now. But I do think that it puts me in a position where I can like give an objective opinion on what's going on. Some people think it's more reliable. Some people don't. Like some people in the comments are talking shit on me right now. That's fine. It's okay. But I think that, I mean, in my personal opinion, both Ukraine and Russia, before this war started, before 2014, before any of the politics and right wing or left wing news media got involved in any of this shit, the average person would have told you that was informed on this part of the world that both of these states are mafia states. They're run by oligarchs. The oligarchs run the mobs, and they're corrupt to the core. Now, both countries have claimed they've done things to correct that situation. You can call it bullshit, you can call it not. I still think that at its core, you're looking at the same general situation, two very corrupt countries, corrupt states, and in my opinion, the fact that we've given one of them access to our information networks and our media, I think is troublesome. I guess you would say. Like I don't think that I guess you could say I do not think it's in the best interest of the American people that we're subjected to Ukrainian propaganda all day, all night. Just like it wouldn't be in our best interest to be subjected to Russian propaganda all day and all night. And I know this is like a slippery slope because we're talking about, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, information, and, they should be able to share these sources. But I don't think it's good that, you have to go to back channels and stuff to see what the Russians are saying. Yet, everything the Ukrainians are saying is front and center on MSNBC and CNN, and they're saying this is fact and anything else is bullshit. And it's like, well, I think, there's equal amount of bullshit coming from both sides, and I don't trust either governments, and I think that's one of the main reasons why someone needs to sit back and look at this whole thing objectively and say, like, okay, like what's really going on? The Russians said this today. Are they full of shit? Are they not? The Ukrainians said this today. Are they full of shit? Are they not? Like, those are the questions that should be asked every time we get a piece of information, because I think that's the level of trust that people should have for both sides. And I think, we do a pretty good job being skeptical about some of the Russian information, but we do a terrible job as a society, Western culture, at being skeptical about Ukrainian information. So
I
that's
agree with that. And I think something like, I'm not an American, I'm half Danish and I live in Europe. But essentially, in the United States, I think that is also a very weird political situation. But there's one clip with Donald Trump, and before everyone goes says Orange Man bad, listen to what I have to say. Essentially, the interviewee is asking, you were trying to have a good relationship with Russia. Now Russia has invaded Ukraine. What do you think of that? And then he's like, oh, the war is bad, all of that stuff. And then he says, when I was like trying to become friends with Russia, that is because I thought, okay, with America first, what is the best thing for the United States? And then he says, okay, Russia has the biggest, the largest, and most capable nuclear arsenal in the world. United States has the second largest, second strongest nuclear capable arsenal in the world. No country would benefit from those two arsenals launching.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is the best way to prevent a nuclear war? Essentially, that is to become friends with the only threat there is in the world. Because if Russia and the United States are friends, then there's no capable nuclear force other than them. You could argue China, but they only have like 600 nukes compared
Mm-hmm.
to Russia having 6,000, the United States having 5,000. So essentially, the better the relation between nuclear powers is, the safer the world is. So he's arguing from a valid point, rather be friends with another nuclear power than enemies. And then Joe Biden's administration has just gone the complete opposite way. We love Ukraine and we hate Russia. And I
Yeah.
just have to say that is very dangerous for the whole world, regardless of feelings, regardless of whatever you think of either side. It is a dangerous situation where two nuclear powers are confronting each other. Just as I would say it is a very dangerous situation if Pakistan and India or India and China started fighting each other. That would be a very dangerous situation because they are two nuclear powers. And then someone on Twitter, I know I'm going into something out of topic, but it's a podcast, so
I
I can
agree.
do that.
Before you go into that, I
Yeah.
agree exactly with what you're saying, and I am disappointed in the position that we've taken. Not necessarily like disappointed in the fact that we're selling weapons. I mean, which a lot of people are. I just have to say, throughout American history, we've always sold weapons and capitalized on these kind of situations. It's not anything different from like what we've ever done, but like it's much more intense this time. Like there's much more political backing behind it. I think had a better approach if it really was determined by someone in the Pentagon that strategically, like, it is in our best interests to help Ukraine win the war. Like, so I'm not a general. I'm not, anything like that. I like history. I have a degree in economics. I like history a lot. I read a lot of history, a lot more than the average person, and I read a lot of history of warfare as well. So like, I'm not a complete idiot when it comes to these things, but I'm not a general. So like, I can't make this assessment as well as one of them can, right? So like, just giving some of these people some credit. Let's just say that they did make the assessment that it was in our best interest and the West's best interest to support Ukraine in this fight. I think it would have been a way better path to do it under the table, similar to Afghanistan, than to flaunt it out in the open, like constantly chastising the Russians and claiming publicly what we're doing, what we're sending. Like, I do not agree with the level. I think the level of public support is very dangerous in terms of like eroding that relationship that you're talking about between two nuclear powers. Like, it seems like the current government in the U.S. and the U.K. especially are doing everything they can to intentionally try and embarrass Russia, which is a very danger. Like, if you were aware of like the history of warfare and the history of national humiliation as a thing, it's never really resulted in anything good. I mean, that's exactly what caused World War II, was the pursuit by the French and the British to humiliate Germany at the end of World War One with like a bad deal. Like, they wanted to humiliate Germany. They wanted to, screw their economy and, force, unbearable concessions on them. And it resulted in, crazy Nazi ideology and, Germany almost conquering the world like 20 years later. So, you don't want to approach any situation like that, in my opinion. And I feel like that's the feeling I get from the Biden administration and the British government in particular, is like they are seeking to humiliate Russia, which is not a good idea. Which, some people that is like, obviously people that are emotionally attached to this whole Ukraine situation, they don't understand what's wrong with that. And if you don't understand it, like, I don't know how else to explain it to you.
as you're saying, the current situation could, like the whole current situation could completely be avoided if there wasn't an interest in pinning Ukraine and Russia up against each other. Because a clear, like a common point between all the Westerners who are pro-Russian, and essentially, I would say there is a fair bit of Westerners who are pro-Russian. That is based on the fact that most of my viewers are Western. I would say about 80% plus are Western. And if you go to my comment section, you can see a lot of "I support Russia" chat messages. I generally do not do anything against one who supports either side. But as soon as you like start dehumanizing the other side or something like that, then I remove that comment. But when you support one side, like go Russia or go Ukraine, I don't mind that. You can say that however much you want in my chat. But essentially, a common talking point or the immediate goal for Westerners who are pro-Russian is not that they support the Russian regime, not that they support the war in Ukraine, not any of that. The only thing that they have in common is that they do not want to be enemies with Russia. They want to be friends with Russia. The European economy, the general Western world would be much safer and much more there would be much more prosperity if they work together rather than against each other. Like currently, we have seen Nord Stream 1 and 2 being blown up. We have seen so many gas pipelines being stopped. We have seen uh, all of these sanctions on the exports and imports from Russia. The whole Russian industry has been separated from Europe. And that is a much bigger blow to Europe than it is to Russia because our whole industry is reliant on the natural resources we get from Russia. Currently, they edited one of the sanctions from the EU to Russia, where instead of not buying any Russian oil at all, the European countries are now allowed to buy Russian oil that has been tempered with. So currently, India is buying record levels of Russian oil to then refine it and then sell it to Europe. And before that, what essentially would happen is that the Russians would sell their oil to India, who would sell their oil to the United States, who then would refine it and sell it to Europe. So essentially, instead of buying it directly and refining it ourselves, we're putting so many extra layers of payment to get the exact same oil. So yeah, the
What do you
Russians are
think of
losing a bit of
this
money
shadow
because
fleet? They're talking about now. There's like what 600 or 700 ships that are not registered anywhere, and they're just turning off their transponders and they're moving all this Russian oil around. It's the craziest thing. And honestly, the person that called this very early on was Alexander Mercurius was talking about it. I mean, early last year, saying that like this oil that they're trying to move out of Russia, I mean, it's not like when you're talking like just general economics, like macroeconomics, like supply and demand, like this isn't the kind of thing that the world can go without. Like everything is so tied into energy. Like the whole entire economies, countries will collapse if they don't have it. So there's not an excess supply of oil in the world. Like if we're not going to buy that Russian oil, someone else has got to buy the Russian oil. Or more likely, we're going to receive oil tankers at Western ports, whether it's New York or Copenhagen or Hamburg, like wherever. Like tankers going to show up. They're going to give them a sheet of paper that says, "Oh, this came from, you know, Equatorial Guinea or like wherever the hell." And it's Russian oil. Like they're just like taking it and they're just messing with the paperwork. And like people have said, like, oh, you can test it, and like like yeah, you can, but like what, like, all right, let's say your government decides they want to start testing the oil, right? So like, okay, we're gonna test every oil tanker to make sure it's not Russian, and if it is Russian, we're gonna send it back out to sea and reject it. It's like, okay, so what happens after that? Now your whole country has no oil, right? Like then prices start soaring, and you got like a bigger problem. Then you got a problem with your population asking like, all right, how come I'm paying $8 a gallon instead of $4 a gallon all of a sudden? It's like, well, we rejected 3 oil tankers this week because they came from Russia. And it's like, okay, so this path, this foreign policy path that we're on, is leading us to economic disaster, and then the support erodes for Ukraine. So like that's the primary reason like why this is going on. It's kind of just a big circle jerk, if you ask me, is like, we want to portray that we're making it more difficult for the Russians to move their oil, which we are. Like it's arguable that if we didn't have these sanctions, Russia would be making way more money off of their oil right now. I will grant them that. It's like the sanctions probably have reduced Russia's income. Now, they haven't worked to the effect that we claimed that they would work. They haven't destroyed the Russian economy, and they have hurt Western economies, yes, but they have probably lowered Russian income. But, if we wanted to do that more, it would work more against us than for us. It would result in bad economic problems that would cause a collapse in support for Ukraine. So that's the main reason why, they're not testing oil imports for this type of thing. Real quick,
I think of two different things we can talk about for today. And I want to start out with this one thing because then I can launch a poll. Me and Ian were thinking about doing some old history in another episode of this podcast that we're planning on starting up, where this is the first episode, where essentially I have come up with some thoughts, and Ian, you can collaborate on those if you want to. But essentially, I have 3 ideas for different old history subjects we can cover. The first one is, what if the US left NATO under Trump? Because that is something he was playing up as a possibility.
Yeah,
the second one is, what if the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and if you're wondering what that is, it is a cooperative defensive alliance between essentially China, India, Pakistan, Iran, and Russia. It's generally all of Central Asia and those countries. What if that organization became similar to NATO with like an Article 5? And then the third one is, what if Arab Spring 2.0 happened?
What, one more time?
Arab Spring 2.0.
Ooh.
Like
that's not like an alt history. That's like a next year type thing.
no, more like because rather, what if the Arab Spring actually succeeded?
What do you so like what do you mean by the Arab Spring actually succeeding? Because diving into this, very excellent book I recommend for people to read. It's called The Looming Tower. It's like a detailed story of everything leading up to 9/11 and what the U.S. Agencies knew about it in advance. So it's like the book is kind of written from the perspective of like, the author of the book went around to like the FBI and CIA or whoever, like all these different departments that were involved in this sort of thing and gathered up what they knew ahead of time, right? So like it is a book from the perspective, but it is very informative. And from that book, actually gained a lot of knowledge on like Osama bin Laden and like what his goals were and everything. So like when you talk about like the Arab Spring, are you saying like what if his goals were achieved and like the Arab world would have been united into a single state, or if just individual uprisings in individual Arab countries, like what if they succeeded? Like,
well, we'll have to find out if we choose that subject, because what is the success of the Arab Spring? We would have to define that, because essentially if the Arab Spring succeeded, then we would see a lot of democratic countries in the Arab world. And the general consensus between those Arab countries is that they should unite. If they all became democratic, then that subject would definitely come up when they talk in bilateral talks with each other. And in that situation, what would happen, who would lead if they agreed, and so on.
So responding to this comment in the chat here, very interesting, because like I'm not saying that that's not the case here with this response, but like it's very interesting. The Arab Spring was actually largely caused by a tripling in wheat prices. So like what had the West, there's probably certain situations where it would have been in MI6 or CIA's interest to help a certain uprising along in a particular country more than another, like say Libya, Syria, like places like that, yes. But like in general, like the population across this entire belt of the world was in uprising. Like, I mean, you're talking like um, Iran, Afghanistan, like even like in Turkey and Azerbaijan, Libya, Algeria, like essentially like the whole of Northern Africa and the Middle East was dealing with protests and problems. Tunisia is like another like really big one. And the main thing was like you're looking at very poor populations that don't have a lot of food locally. Every country in this area has to import, and there was a bad crop in Russia that year. It might have actually been fires, like forest fires or something. I'm not sure, but for some reason, Russia that year decided to close off wheat exports, and it caused wheat prices to triple. And then, that resulted in probably more than tripling food prices in all of the Middle Eastern countries. And, that angers people. Now, with that public anchor, that does create opportunities for meddling, say, like Libya, Syria, things like that. Not saying that, didn't happen, but largely it was caused by an economic event.
To add to that explanation, I am half Egyptian and I was actually living in Egypt at the time of the Arab Spring. And I can say from my knowledge and from my experience and so on, that essentially the Arab Spring had nothing to do with the color revolution. The color revolution comes later. Starting out with the Arab Spring, I believe there was a general dissatisfaction with the political situation in, well, essentially, I would, rather than calling it the Arab Spring, I'll call it the Muslim Spring, because the Arab Spring wasn't about being, it was a lot of Arab countries, but all of those Arab countries were Muslim countries, and they were all aiming to become a more Islamic country, all of them, from Morocco all the way to Syria and Iraq. All of those countries were all trying to become more Islamic. So the whole essence of that was that there has been the multiple political parties. For example, in Egypt, there was the Muslim Brotherhood, where they essentially have been building up strength for many decades, ever since the Second World War. And then they had finally manifested enough power to do something. And then as soon as the fire happened where the guy burned himself up in Tunisia, everything just, all hell broke loose, as they say. And all of those countries finally decided, okay, now is the moment. And then they were getting support from, for example, from Turkey. Turkey was supporting Egypt's protests and so on. And generally, the whole situation was a mess, but essentially, it had nothing to do with the West. The West was actually in tears after the Arab Spring. And I say that because all of the Arab leaders in these countries that were under the Arab Spring were Western imposed leaders. They were leaders that supported the West. Like the leader in Egypt, his name was Hosni Mubarak. He had essentially been supporting the West for many, many decades. And he has been doing whatever they say to him and so on. And the same with most other countries. And then after the Arab Spring,
to clarify, like what I think you're trying to say there, the West was supporting him for a means to an end, right? Like like Egypt. If people don't realize this, like the Suez Canal cuts through Egypt, so it's always been like very important for Western countries, which control commerce and maritime world, right? Like the Suez Canal is like one of the most important pieces of infrastructure for all of that. So like there's been a lot of geopolitical drama, to put it lightly, throughout modern history since the canal has been built. So like whether it's Western appointed leaders in Egypt or just straight up Western invasions of Egypt, like if you want to look into a very interesting conflict, potentially a future topic for the podcast, the Suez crisis in the late 50s, early 60s, a very, very fascinating event where the French and English actually tried to seize the canal zone from what was the old Egyptian?
Let me continue before that.
Okay.
Okay, so a second important point, as you mentioned, the Suez Canal, but a second point is actually Israel. And that is because after the Arab Spring, a lot of the leaders in these countries were leaders that were anti-Israel. They were leaders that would prefer being enemies instead of friends with Israel. And then comes the second part of the Arab Spring, which was in 2014. What happened in 2014? Can anyone tell me? The Maidan. So essentially, the US launched a long series of orange revolutions in 2014, including in Egypt, in Syria, in Ukraine, a lot of countries, and essentially overthrew all of these countries that got their independence in 2011. And all of these leaders that were imposed were all pro Israeli and pro Western democratic leaders. And then we see, for example, in Egypt, we have someone who isn't exactly the most, let's say it in a way so I can actually enter Egypt again. He's getting 99% in all elections. I think that explains it well enough. He's a
It's
great leader,
one of the best
99%.
things.
He's gotta be like genius. He's only beat by that one African leader who gets like 120% in the elections.
Dude, it's like one of the funniest things about
Yeah.
I mean, just really like the situation like in Ukraine and Russia and Belarus and like all these places like where people think they understand what's going on and like listen, I don't even fully understand what's going on. There's very few people that really understand what's going on, but all these places like put out like similar polling for stuff like when it comes to the Russian president, the Ukrainian president, the Belarusian president, they all win elections by like over 90%. There's no 90% of anyone in that part of the world that agrees on anything. Like, especially like, I mean, especially like Ukraine, like, and I'm not saying like, I do think like a majority of like the population of Ukraine wants to like defend their country, but you're talking about a country with 36% of the population speaks Russian as their birth language, and that language is banned, and you're telling me that 95% of the country is like in favor of the war. Like, it's not, I mean, it just doesn't make any kind of sense at all. Like I don't trust any polling coming out of any polling that shows anything over I mean, looking at like American elections per se. Like, a lot of people like this is a great example. People want to say like American elections are fraudulent. It's like the last couple elections, like people have been saying that like crazy, and they try to find fraudulent stuff, and like nothing comes up. And both sides dig for it when it's to their own advantage, right? Like, and that's one of the things you don't realize. Like, the Democrats dig in and say, "Oh, this election was fraudulent too," and they never find anything, right? But like those elections always come out 51-49, 52-48, and it's like, so it's like, there's some legitimacy to like close calls like that. Whereas like, what's his name, Fadal El-Sisi or whatever, like winning with a 99% votes is like borderline hilarious. There's like one, I think it was like Lukashenko's election in Belarus where he said, he got like 95% vote, and he was like, it was actually 100%, but we had to give 5% back to the other side to make it look more legit. so he's like, openly admitting to like, messing with the elections is super funny.
Dude.
But yeah, I mean, listen, this claim here, like there's a lot of aspects to U.S. elections that are corrupt. But the actual, when you're talking about the actual vote count at the end, I disagree entirely. Like, there's so many cameras watching those people. Like, there's so much observation of it. Like, it's very, very, it would be difficult to impossible. Like, almost to the point to where if it did happen, the margin of error would be like super low, and there's so many votes to count in general. Like, it would, I get it. Like, if someone wins an election by 12 votes, like, that's within a certain margin of error, and like there needs to be a recount and stuff like that. And like there's different ways the media influences elections, and then like if you want to talk about like ballot harvesting and stuff like that, yeah, I think that's sketchy. But like overall, in terms of the count and things like that, there's I think it's a lot more secure than most countries, and I prefer these slim margin outcomes over like, oh, this person won by 100%. I think it's bullshit.
I think something when it comes to elections, and that is very suspicious with the United States, is the media. In Denmark, we have a very high election participation. I think it's over 80%.
The
So
Chinese haven't figured
basically,
out.
everyone who's eligible is voting. And up to elections, they keep doing these polls like every day. And about 20% are what they are, so the so-called doubters. They don't know what they're going to vote until they actually go into the ballot, and then they decide right there. So in a situation like the United States, where all of the social media is bought by one party and all of the media is bought by one party, where they essentially change the narrative to fit whatever they want to say, if it's true or not. I think that is very suspicious, because these doubters are most likely going to vote with that, because they're going to read the news, they're going to go on Twitter, and they're going to see these posts taken out of context or made to fit the narrative, formulated in a way that essentially supports their goal. And then a lot of these people who aren't that interested in politics, but just go because they feel like they want to do it, they always end up choosing whatever is mainstream, and whatever's mainstream is depending on what the media and social media is saying.
I agree, and I think that's where the trouble is. And like, I'm getting roasted in the comments right now, but like, the issues with American elections are more information related, and I 100% agree with that. Like, there's some studies done that, like, say Facebook can do like, say the night before an election, they can do a little bit of changes in their algorithm, and they can affect the turnout in a particular state, like by positive 10,000. So like, if that turnout in a specific state is in favor of a specific party, like, essentially, like, they can ensure victory for a certain candidate in a certain state, because they can say, all right, let's send out a notification to 100,000 people in Pennsylvania, at 8 o'clock in the morning, because our algorithm says that's the most likely time that they'll get the message, right? And we'll tell all those people, hey, it's election day, don't forget to show up and vote, and they could potentially send that message out only to Democrats or Republicans or, whoever. Like, there's big problems when it comes to, the information space around elections, but like, I just don't agree with the count, issues being with the count. I don't think there's any issues with that, but, very marginal issues with that. But we should get off elections before YouTube bans us.
Yeah. All right. I think that is all the topics I had. Do you have anything?
No, I mean, I just, like, people, you should follow myself and Mr. Weeb on Twitter, like, because we're gonna start doing. Let me pull this up so everyone can see our profiles. So, follow us on Twitter, because we're going to start polling, because like, we want to turn this into a regular podcast, and we want to I don't want to say like not talk about Ukraine, but like, we want to diversify into like other topics and talk about other things. So we really want to focus on history, politics, economics, alternate history, like, more fun things like that. And we're probably going to create a new channel. So like, we're going to do this separately. We might do a couple episodes where we share them on our channels, but like, we're probably going to have our own spot for that. So like, we'll do some polls on here for topics. We'll do some polls for, maybe logos. Like, if someone wants to help us out with some cool, like, combined logo. Let me find, Weeb's account here. So make sure you follow both of us on Twitter. We'll run these polls. We'll just retweet them or whatever, and we'll get some feedback from you guys about like what you want to see and what you want to talk about. We're going to try to avoid. I like having the chat, but we're going to avoid like engaging with it unless there's like super chats and stuff. Like, of course, you can donate, you can super chat, and we'll answer your questions pretty quick. But other than that.
Yeah.
We'll
And
be
quickly, I
talk.
did a poll on my channel about the old history, and the one with the majority of the three options is if US left NATO under Trump, with 55% of the vote. And from my election eyes, it is we need a recount. So let me get my glasses on. So you have another minute to vote if you haven't done so yet.
And this
What
is
do
on
you want
YouTube.
to
YouTube
hear
poll.
about? This is on my YouTube channel.
I'll go ahead.
While we wait for your votes, we can look at this donation. Thank you very much, Wallace0071, for the $5 Australian. Stalingrad was the most important battle of World War II and a turning point for Germany. Is Bakhmut going to be the same, or will there be a bigger battle? I'll let you start, and then I'll follow up.
I do not think there will be a bigger battle in terms of manpower, but I think um, maybe if there's a similar battle for Kharkiv, like as you know, like a 8 or 9 month drawn out battle for Kharkiv, if that ever happens, then I think that would trump Bakhmut for sure. Now, like I don't know, like what does the audience think? Like, which do you think was a bigger battle, Bakhmut or Mariupol? You know, like in terms of like importance or whatever metric you want to use there.
Honestly, my perspective is that yes, there will be a bigger battle, and it will be the final battle of this war. I'm not sure where it will be or how it will be, and so on. I think the Russians and Ukrainians are both preparing an offensive. I'm not sure who will be ready first, but I believe the ones to strike first will decide where that battle will be. And then whoever launches that battle, they will essentially put all their cards on the table, and the opposite side will react to that. And then whatever the outcome of that battle will be, it will probably be the biggest battle of this war. And whatever the outcome of that battle will be, will determine the whole war. I believe that.
I think that's a good assessment. We got people in the chat saying Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa, Kiev.
I'll give my shot that it will not be Odessa. I think if Russia ever gets Odessa, then it will be because the Ukrainian army either is unable to fight or surrenders because of how far away it is.
Yeah, outside of potentially a Russian incursion across the Belarusian border, I don't think you're going to see any fighting across on that side of the Dnieper this year.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't think so either.
All right. It seems that no one else wants to vote on the poll, and it's essentially the same. After fine tuning the votes, it is 53% in favor of if US left NATO under Trump. So I guess we can take a look at that while we
Next
prepare
Saturday,
for
that's the
next.
topic.
Yeah,
That's the topic for the
exactly.
next podcast. So
Yep.
make sure you guys stay tuned for that. I never found where this poll was. You said it was on your YouTube channel?
Yeah, it's on my live stream, in my live stream chat.
Oh, in your live stream chat.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. I didn't know you could. Oh wow! Look at that. I didn't know you could do that. You learn something every day. You know.
What do you think that the possibility of China attack Taiwan very soon for helping Russia if China opening second front on Asia? That is such a heavy question for when we are ending off.
Yeah, we can get that next time.
Yeah.
Else.
So make sure to come next time when we run the second episode of this podcast, and I'll make sure to answer that question then, as we talk about if the US left NATO under Trump.
All right, thanks everyone.
Yep, that is going to be all for this episode, and I hope you will all enjoy our first episode of History and War, or as we call it, it's HAW, HAW. And this is the first episode. How is Bakhmut similar to Stalingrad? Thank you
All right,
for
thanks
watching,
everyone. Have a good
see
day.
you all next time.
See you next time.